All right, on to the video I'm sure everybody has been waiting so long for. Is mixing an art or is it a science? We'll talk about that a little in this video, and we'll also examine our approach to mixing in this course. And it's a pretty lenient approach. It's very broad, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But obviously, we all know that mixing is both an art and it is a science. And that's true for pretty much all the mediums, all of the arts, any creative task. If you are a graphic designer and you work in advertising and you're making some kind of ad campaign and you're making a banner, it's both artistic, but you're also then probably playing on human psychology to make people look at your thing and make them want to buy your product, or at the very least, at least encourage them to be looking at that and read what's on there. So that's both an art and a science. You think about filmmaking, setting the scene, what you do with the cutting. It's there's a lot of theory to it. There's a lot of scientific theory, but at the same time, it's still art. And here we have a painting by Piero della Francesca, in art history, the go-to guy for this kind of conversation of, painting, art and science blended together because, talk about perspective and vanishing point and, getting a 3D image on a 2D surface, and you can just look at all of the sharp angles in here, and you can tell that what he's done with this painting, there's a lot of science that's gone into this. There's a lot of math, there's a lot of theory, but at the end of the day, it's still a piece of art. And mixing is so much that way. However, I do believe it is useful to try and break it up into, are you going to lean more towards the science or are you leaning more towards the art, and what exactly that means. So if we're thinking about mixing purely as a science, I decided to put a few bullet points down here. Of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, and a lot of this is up to interpretation. But to me, breaking it up and saying, okay, here's the way you're thinking about mixing from a scientific standpoint, from an artistic standpoint, is useful for when you're setting your own goals and ways of going about approaching the mix that you're working on. So number one, this is a given: advanced technical knowledge and a diverse skill set, which just means that you've been there, you've been around the block, you know how to solve problems without having to go outside of the box. So you listen to a guitar part and you're like, yep, you know what? That needs compression. I need to do this with it. Either I need to actually, literally compress it, meaning that I'm trying to reduce dynamic range, or maybe I need more pumping and breathing action so that I can get more movement into the part. That's a very scientific way of looking at it. You understand what the compressor is designed for. You know the sort of settings that you're going to be putting on, and you also have a lot of techniques under your belt. But are you really going to go too far? Are you going to stretch yourself too much? Not unless you absolutely have to. Next, understanding your palette. And of course, I'm talking about your sonic palette. So knowing the difference between, let's say, your compressor. So you say, okay, this is a very mu compressor. I know what that means. This is a solid state compressor. I know what this means. This is a FET compressor. Understanding those differences, knowing the technical details. That's knowing the science. And then the art is kind of knowing what it's supposed to be paired with. But chances are you know that because of things that you've read, or just the historical significance because you've been around the block for a while. And we're talking about emulations here and plugins, so it's a little bit more gray area. But if you know, for example, okay, here's this LA2A plugin. I know that in the past this is routinely used on vocals, routinely used on bass, and you can hear that it's actually enhancing the sound, getting the desired effect you want. It's a very scientific way of going about it. You have your hypothesis, you test it out, and then you get your conclusion, and you're hoping that it's going to match up from what you know to then what you're actually doing. All right. So the other thing with understanding your palette is actually being aware of all that's out there. Okay, and that's a biggie, and that's why most professional mix engineers, I look at them more as scientists for pretty much actually all of these reasons. But they know what's out there, they know the differences, they can hear the differences, and then when they get into that situation where they're mixing a track, it's almost instinctual, it's almost second nature to them to pull to something. And this is also why it can be somewhat difficult to learn mixing from a very well-seasoned, from an expert master mix engineer engineer. I don't mean like mastering engineer, but somebody who really knows their stuff when it comes to mixing, because they take things for granted and they work based on instinct. And to them, it's the right way because it's getting them the results that they want. But you could watch another like really good mix engineer probably do the exact opposite things, but they have a reason for it. And normally it's based on like science and it's based on experience. The other biggie, and this is a huge one, emulation and referencing. And again, this goes back to like hypothesis, you test it out, experiment, and then the conclusion. So if I have a reference track and I want to be competitive with that, I listen to that reference, I listen to my mix, I immediately start coming up with, I have to do this. I know how to execute it. I keep going back, A-Bing back and forth. You're like a chef who's tried a dish and now you're trying to recreate it. Does art go into that? It absolutely does. But at the end of the day, you want a specific result. You know, for me, then that becomes a little bit more scientific. And then the last one here is compromise. And this is the word that I would use if I had to just define mixing in one word. It would be compromise. You understand that when you are listening to your track and when you are mixing that track, that for something to sound bright, other things have to possibly be dull or more dull. For something to be in the front, there has to be something in the back. It's this balancing act that you're playing. And yeah, it can be artistic, but it's very much scientific. You're thinking to yourself, okay, I want to make sure that if somebody listens to it really loud, for example, the bass doesn't like overpower this. But when they're still listening at like a moderate level, I still hope they hear it. So you're taking all of those things into consideration. Whereas when you're thinking about a mix purely as an art or as an artist, it's a little bit different. You need basic technical knowledge. So understanding, how a compressor works, understanding what an EQ does, what a reverb does, but you don't necessarily know all of the details, and you don't necessarily know how this stuff has been used in the past. So you might put a reverb on something, not realizing that this is a plate reverb and what that means and what a plate reverb is typically used on. You're just experimenting. You're willing to try something. You know you want a reverb, but you don't really know which reverb, or maybe you only have access to one. Okay, so basic technical knowledge, knowing what this stuff is supposed to do, but you don't really have any preconceived notions on how to use it. Understanding your palette, again, your sonic palette. So what's the difference here from an artist perspective versus a scientist perspective? A couple things. Number one, the number of tools when you're an artist is usually very limited. So somebody would ask me, or people do ask this sometimes, do I need all of these emulations? Do I need all of these tools? And I ask, okay, well, what are you going for? What are you trying to do? If your goal is to be a mix engineer, to be able to mix every style and genre of music, then absolutely, yes, you need all of those tools. You need all of those options so that you can make those pairings. But if you're just an artist, you can work with what you have, because great artists can make great art with anything, with any material. So you don't need to break the bank if you're really just working on your own music, or, mixing stuff for a friend, and it doesn't really matter. There's no like hard deadline, or, there's not going to be a million revisions being called in. So making the best of what you have as opposed to having everything. The next bullet, your ear is going to dictate to you what is good as compared to a reference track. All right, so you will have influences. For example, you will kind of in the back of your head know, like, I'm kind of mixing this genre of music and I like this genre of music, so I know what it's supposed to sound like. But you aren't necessarily being constantly and even consciously thinking about it when you're mixing the track. If it ends up that way, wow, you have a great ear and a great memory. But if it doesn't end up that way, that's also totally fine and okay. Also, with your ear kind of dictating to you what's good, it's going to sound great on your own system. But as an artist, think about artists in general, pretty selfish. It's all about them. You're not going to care too much how it's translating, because to you, you know what the perfect volume is. You have that perfect system, and that's the way that music is supposed to be listened to. Right? That's a biggie. It's how that music's supposed to be listened to. When you go into a movie theater, right, and it's like an IMAX movie specifically designed for IMAX, it's not designed to come out on DVD later or be shown on TV. They know I'm going to mix this for IMAX, for what we have, for that sound system, for that screen. And so they don't really care too much if somebody's going to be watching it on their smartphone. Nowadays, that's a consideration that people make. And so there's a lot of compromise. But here, the need to compromise as an artist, if some people listen to it and it's a bad experience, I mean, that's art. Not everybody is going to like what you do. And that's part of being an artist. And the last bullet point here, you're going to experiment away. You're going to go crazy. You'll go outside the box as a norm as compared to an exception. So you hear something, you go, I could do it this way, but it would be really crazy. And when you go with it will be really crazy, you actually go that way. And that's the way that you approach it. So our approach here, as I'm sure many of you have probably anticipated, I'm not the sort of person who's going to say there's a right way and there's a wrong way. I'm going to tell you it's totally up to you. If you want a reference, if you want to look at it like a science, by all means go for it, but you don't have to do that. So my recommendation, at least for right now, would be to let your ear and instincts guide you. This course is all about making music. It's about having fun. It's about expressing yourself creatively. If you want to drastically change the stems, like when you're working with maybe my track or someone else's track, feel free to change it completely. I mean, you can even change the arrangement if you want to do that and end up making a new song. There's no producer that's sitting over your shoulder telling you what to do or asking for revisions, which means do what you want. Exercise that creative freedom. If you want it to sound like something that already exists, like, you want it to be Beatport ready or, mixed for the radio as practice, by all means do that, because that's going to be useful. No matter what, just remember that actually sitting down and doing, as compared to just talking about doing or procrastinating, no matter what you do, the act of sitting down and working on it is going to be beneficial to you. So, you can either take my recommendations or, just do what feels right for you. And that's the way that we're going to be looking at it moving forward.